Good evening, everyone. So, Anna, you're a tricky one, aren't you? But first of all, let me say thank you for this performance this evening. You covered so much material in those characters, those personalities that you portrayed. And in many ways, I have so many things swirling around in my head and trying to think about this issue of educational inequality. And we've had many conversations together over the last year. And I've watched you personally for decades take on these really big social issues, and you're now taking on one that, as you mentioned in the show, one might want to ask whether or not it's a civil rights issue of the moment. And you turned that question on to us last night, but we're going to flip it back onto you tonight to ask you this evening. Because I want to know, given the vast array of characters, of persons whom you've interviewed over the last year or so, how it's framed similarly or differently. You started with an academic, and then you got into these teachers and people who work with children. There's such an array of people in society. I want to know how they're talking about this as an issue in our society, similarly or different. I kept thinking, are the academics getting it right? Are the researchers getting it right when I listen to the other characters? And so I wonder if you just start off talking about the similarities and differences in the different kinds of people you've talked to over the last year.
Well, I mean, I think the reason that I launched it and did such a long piece in terms of Stephanie Williams is I think that there's so much. You know, one of the things I thought about when I started working like this in the late 70s, it was really inspired by Shakespeare. And the amount, there was a book that I read when I was in acting school at ACT called The Elizabethan World Picture. And just the idea of how much was in, there are libraries and libraries and libraries filled with analyses of what was in, what Shakespeare saw, what he smelled, what he felt, inside of each character. And so I think with Stephanie Williams, there's a huge world in there that is about her privileges, about her suffering, about the fact, one of the things that has struck me that's really amazing is the amount of violence that I am hearing about, that people's stories are filled with violence as though it were nothing, like, oh, was it a drug overdose? No, it wasn't a drug overdose. She threw herself in front of a train. Boom. And many times like that, there were things that people told me that were, just so much violence. And I think also with her, I've met many people who I call wounded healers, and she really is one, maybe as a young teacher, people who are here who are more older teachers would tell her not to let her kids use her iPhone or whatever, I don't know. Or maybe don't hug that kid. I don't know what they would say. But I think that there's a lot of compassion. I think that the conversation needs to be filled with a call for compassion and love. And that's something, even in acting classes, we only talk about love in terms of like, love your character. But we don't really talk about love. I don't know why that's such a taboo. But it seems to me that maybe that's something that has to be thought about, and to have a more loving society in a very big way and not such a punitive society, which is, of course, why we're in the state that we are with the school-to-prison pipeline of kids being yanked out of school for what would be, called mischief in wealthy communities and sent to jail. But I also think that, kids like Stanford students are under much more pressure than even when I started teaching here in 1990. And I never heard of the expression test anxiety until I did this project. And I think just the sense that you have to be perfect, Michael Sandel's book, the case against perfection, that you've got to be perfect. And when we think of what it takes to get a kid to Stanford with lots of resources and I suppose, a lot of love and many, many people. And that we would think that kids who come from these environments full of trauma, whether it's trauma that comes with our new neighbors, people like Roberto Pena, the coming from a history of trauma, or whether the kind of trauma that Nadine Burke Harris told me about yesterday at her extraordinary clinic, graduate of Stanford Medical School, did a residency here rather, toxic stress, the effect of trauma on cognitive development. And so,
So are we asking the right questions then? Because you're talking about things that in the field of inequality, particularly in educational research, I don't read a lot of research, maybe in health studies or epidemiological studies.
Well, that's the educational epidemiologist.
Right, that's right. But I just thinking about, that's the question I'm stuck with after listening to you tonight. Are we asking the right questions? Are we measuring the right processes to lend an understanding or deeper insight into what's happening to children in this country who are less fortunate? Do you think, I mean, you've interviewed a lot of us types.
I don't know. I hear some of you arguing about what should happen about testing or not, what that should be. I'm an actor, so I'm interested in full humans, feeling humans, struggling humans, wounded humans.
Right.
So I'm very interested in the struggles that people have and wondering what in the world can be done to break generations of violence and poverty and incarceration, because that's also it.
So when you talk to people, what do you find that's hopeful? So it seems to me.
You don't think Ms. Wayman is hopeful?
I think she's very hopeful.
Get on the bus, right?
Yeah, and Ms. Williams too. But you've talked about your sort of long trajectory of work as kind of this search for the American character in sort of instances of heightened stress or tension or something, the riots, death, sickness, dying. So what do you learning about the American character by looking closely at education?
Well, I certainly have been influenced by some of the conversations that I've had with the two of you. And I think, one of the things about America right now that I'm sure lots of people in here may or want to say something about is something you've talked about, Sean, is the idea that we know that the gap between rich and poor is vast, but that you see the wealthy pulling away from the middle class in a sort of exponential way. And so I suppose one of the questions for us as Americans is, are we going to have to give up some basic ideas we had about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps? And I guess the immigration debate definitely is causing a big question about, is everybody welcome? Did everybody need to be welcome in the first place? Or was it just, useful to have people coming from all over the world? And then I'm very distressed that with what happened in the Supreme Court. And I'm very distressed that people don't think that we've made much progress in 60 years since Brown versus Board of Ed, and it might be worse, and that we're living in kinds of segregation again. And certainly in the poor environments that I went to, I saw torn up, broken down environments that just are uninhabitable.
How did some of the people whom we met in those environments, I heard very personal stories to the biography, but researchers often talk about this abstract structural stuff or the material, this stuff outside the person, and you took us very much inside the person. But do you also hear from when you're talking to the kids, when you're talking to people in the communities, are they talking about those big things too, like segregation or poverty, inequality?
Not that often, and it could be who I'm talking to. Every once in a while, more in sort of some grassroots organizations with people who are highly educated. A young lady I met who is running an organization in Philadelphia who went to Haverford those questions about structure are not, I'm not hearing it that much. And of course, I visited the White House for the launch of Brother's Keeper, and some people would say that they would like Washington to be talking about structural change more than they are. But I am happy that the Department of Education, released a report that all the people working on this school-to-prison pipeline have been talking about for several years. So that's a sort of good housekeeping stamp of, if not approval, like it is true. It ain't fair, right? Black and brown and Native American kids are really suffering, and it's not fair what's happening to them.
Does anyone say anything to you that's surprising, or does anyone defend the situation? That is, you interview sort of people at all levels of society, at all sort of perspectives on it. But does anyone say anything to you that argues in favor of something about the status quo?
I would like somebody, if you know somebody like that, I would like to meet them. I mean, I do aspire to be able to see the whole thing, and I don't have access to those people. So if anybody knows anybody like that who would like to talk, I would love to hear that perspective.
Yeah, what someone says, all I do. But where is the tension? That does raise the question. Where do you see the tension among the personalities and what they're talking about, or the conflict, whether it's latent or very explicit among the different constituencies whom you've talked to?
I mean, I suppose there could be more tension about the responsibility of the kids themselves. But some people kind of think, not always, but, cautious not to blame the victim, I would say. I wonder about phrases that people throw around. I get curious about phrases like, every parent wants what's best for their every parent wants what's best for their children. And I pushed Dr. Burke Harris on that yesterday, because she wrote that. And ultimately she said, every parent wants what's best for their children at no cost to them. She changed it. Pediatrician.
That's provocative. Speaking of the children, one of the things that we do in this world that we spend a lot of time in, Sean and I especially, is that we hear a lot from grown people. We hear a lot from adults, from researchers, policymakers. Many people have a take on it. But one of the things I know you're doing is you're also talking to the kids, to youth. And I wonder if you could tell us how you plan to bring their voices in to the process.
I will. Kids who are doing okay don't have very much to say. They are not, that's a problem that I have as an artist. They are not, most of the kids who are doing very well are not expressive in the way that I need them to be for the type of theater I do. If I'm taking photographs or making a movie, it'd be different. The kids who are in a bad way tend to be pretty expressive. I probably worry a little bit about how I'll ultimately find a kind of balance about that fact. Because it could be that kids who are in a bad way, maybe the fact that they lack that sort of reserve has something to do or reflects on a kind of privacy that the kids who are doing well feel is okay. I don't know. What do y'all think about that?
I do such a different kind of work that,
He's the epidemiologist.
And I'm really worried about what I might say out loud here, since, but I watch you and I think, wow, at the 30,000-foot landscape at which I and other people sort of operate, or the national policy conversation, or the sort of big descriptive world, what we miss is all the stuff that's in those portraits you do, the deep complexity of the individual people, the kind of passion, the love, the fear, the exhaustion of the teachers, all of that never, none of those people really talked about testing or education policy or anything. They talked about this real experience of doing the day-to-day work that they do and experiencing it. And so it makes me wonder how these very different kind of conversations can learn from one another, can speak to each other or something. And so it's part of why I love what you do, is because it's so different than the world in which I operate.
Well, I've told you that you should be an educational ethnographer. I think you would be an amazing ethnographer, the way you listen to people, the way you can embody, you pick up the nuances, the idiosyncrasies and stuff. So I wonder if this is also a conversation about how different types of people should be a part of the policy process, should be a part of the knowledge building process, the science making process. What do you think?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
definitely. And I also think, there's a judge who interests me so much in Philadelphia. Judge Anders is his name, who really works very hard in a really limited way that, to have an effect on the people that stand before him. And when I went to interview him, he was prepared for me with a whole folder of photographs of a boy at 8 years old, first time he was in the system, terrified, and then all like this thick of pictures of him until now that he's covered in tattoos and, he looks like a thug, and he's in for murder. And Judge Anders said that, he was trying to think of what to say. And actually, he had a complicated thing, because if the guy actually went out on the streets, people think he lied and just said he had done this murder because he had snitched. And so if he went on the street, he would be killed. And so he thought maybe it'd be better to be in prison for life or whatever. And so Judge Anders said, I said to him, looking at this file, this system has failed you. And basically saying, I want to apologize for that. Even though you're here now, and I'm going to put you away, this system has failed you. And he talked about how he got word from somebody a couple of years later or something. The particular gentleman asked about Judge Anders, how's the judge doing? And when this judge told me this, judge in this fancy office, he burst out crying. And he said, I couldn't believe he said it. He said, he cares about me. The judge cared that the prisoner cared about him. And the judge cares about the prisoner. And so, over the last couple of years, I've been thinking about Martin Buber and the whole I-thou idea and the extent to which we're turning people into its. Martin Luther King speaks about that very well in a letter from a Birmingham jail. We have all these I-it relationships going on. I-it. My friend Diana Cohn invited me to a lovely dinner, and David Harris was there. Joan Baez, were they married or together some kind of way? And he asked a really provocative question, which was, when did education stop being about relationships and start to become a commodity? And, you all are paying a lot of dough to come to school. And I started teaching in 1973, and my students have become wealthier and wealthier and smarter over the years. And the relationship it's different than when I started. And you have a right to expect a lot for all this dough. You have absolute right. And I get it, but it's a lot of money. And this commodity thing is really serious. So when I meet people like that judge who value a relationship with the person back there, I would say that if policy is not thinking about relationships and how to make better, healthier relationships, then you are missing something, because that's at the center of it.
But it seems to me that your kind of work, that art, that the communication about the complexity of the human relationships embedded in sort of education could be a powerful way of sort of changing some of the conversation in ways that the kind of work that I and my colleagues often do doesn't seem to be able to have the same effect, because it doesn't create the kind of empathy. It doesn't create the same kind of...
But I think you should be careful when you talk like that, because, I mean, I experience the two of you as incredibly empathic people. I experience, it was such a gift to come here in January and start this whole process by talking to folks right here at Stanford. And, having had, I see Phil Pizzo in the audience, a wonderful relationship of my last play, Let Me Down Easy with the medical school. Which, by the way, I think some of their questions were about, what's the human thing? What is it? And also, how do we tell the bad news to people who won't want to hear it? And so I think you do yourself a disservice not to own it, that you are empathic individuals, and that it's in every cell in your body, in the whole way you are, in the whole way you communicate. And, I think you should own that. And it does influence even, the way you deliver your data. So I think you're both putting a face on it.
I believe that.
I mean, the fact that you're both here together, what this says, the unspoken fact of this project that the two of you, a white man and an African-American woman, have. I mean, to me, that's very moving and very hopeful, and I just think it's terrific. I think it's, we see these kinds of collegiality. But I think that you come from such different places in your lives, the way that I understand it, and I think that that is a very human thing that is going to influence how you look at inequality, as I think your relationship is going to inform how you look at inequality.
So here's this tension, though, Anna. It's like to find the right tools so that we have to exist here. Maybe we don't have to worry so much now that we're at the top of the chain in some kind of way. But for many young scholars of inequality, they have to speak, they have a master in terms of the person, the people, the structures to whom they have to respond in order to be perceived as legitimate scholars. And that means we talk a different talk.
Right.
And what this art, your talent allows you to do is to speak in a way that we are so not able to speak in. And so I wonder if you could actually counsel us, if you will, on how to do that better. Because you're saying, I do believe we're empathic individuals, but they say we're being irrational or non-rational if we spend too much on that soft, fuzzy stuff. That's too warm. We got to be on the hardcore data. I mean, a lot of us have to be the rugged empiricist. That's what science is. And so how do we mesh those things? I think that's the big tension for us. And I was kind of curious. I watched you as I listened to the lead academic, Maxine Green, whom I respect, and listened to the other people's stories. There were some striking differences in the dialogue. And I wonder if you see that more and more.
No, because I think Maxine is calling for. I just love Maxine.
Well, I'm not in any way saying anything
I think
negative. She's
calling for. She's, I just crazy about how she talks. I think, she grew up in a time where, she was out in the streets and she saw a kid who'd been bitten by a rat in the face, and it changed her life. She was a part of these, when people got evicted, they'd go and put the furniture back inside. I mean, she was a radical. She was a rebel when she was a kid. So, and her saying, about Debbie, how could you have a school where you don't know that somebody died the night before? There's no difference between that and what Stephanie's talking about.
Oh, this is true.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to open it up to folks from the audience to ask questions. And that is just, so what do you hope that this piece of work accomplishes in the world as
I
you
hope
do
that, because my intention is to take it to cities before it's a finished work of art, because I think that there's, I, like anybody, would eager to make another work of art, and this will eventually, hopefully, be that. But I think that the ragged state actually asks an audience to bring more than if I allow them to simply laugh and cry out of all of the sort of skilled things that I and all the people who work with me do, the lights, the sounds, all the things we do to get you to laugh and cry and stuff. But when people always say to me, well, what do you want people to take away? I say, well, I think the audience is bringing a lot. And so, if there's a mother out there who's trying to get her kid into Stanford, or a mother who's trying to keep her kid out of jail, she's bringing a lot to this. And I'm going to take this around to the cities where I've been and have sort of stage readings and town halls where people can stand up and say something, and hopefully along the way I'll meet somebody who basically will tell me to my face, put them in there and lock up the key. And hopefully they'll show up. And so that we can have the kinds of dialogues that we don't get to have because we rely too much on the media to do the talking for us. I want the citizens to talk.
So speaking of town hall, it's now your time. It's your time to ask questions. There are people who will be walking around with microphones for questions, or are they lining up? I can't really see.
So there should be a microphone, 2 up top and 2 on the sides. Please keep your questions relatively brief so that other folks have a chance to ask questions as well. And I can't see the microphones. Where's the microphone, people?
Yes, please
stand.
Stand.
Here's a question back here.
Hi, thank you, Anna, for this. This has been terrific. Can you tell us what you think it is that makes someone a good listener, and why is that hard for so many people?
Probably because we're ruining our eardrums with all these things that we put in them to hear walking around. I guess, to listen, you have to really want to know, and the only way you can really want to know is to really not know. I always start every class now that I teach by saying, confidence is overrated, give doubt a try. I think doubt and truly not knowing. I don't think you should ask a person a question if you know the answer, maybe in the courtroom, but, don't waste your time. Go and talk to people, if you really want to know something. And that's really, I think, what helps us learn to become better listeners.
I think over here. Is there a question over there? Yes? No? If you have a question, you have to find the person with the microphone. Here's one up here.
Hi. I'm in the theater department here, and I've taught college-level English courses at San Quentin Prison. And so my question is sort of about education in prisons. And maybe that's a little after the fact for this project, except I think we never want to think it's too late, right? But I think it was in the 80s when we got tough on crime, when we outlawed federal funds for education in prisons. And I wondered if your project was going to take up the idea of education once in the prison, or if that was sort of outside the purview of the project.
Probably not really. I think that there are a lot of really, really wonderful programs inside of prisons, arts programs and education programs. So probably not. I'm probably going to stick in that area of the things that are broken outside of that. Although one of the people I've been speaking to is somebody who teaches school in a jail. I think for people I've talked to who've gotten out, who've finished serving their time, the fact of their education inside was very, very important to them. And I don't know where Stanford is on this, but I know NYU and John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I suspect many more, are developing programs to help people get college degrees while they're inside. So I think that we'll have a lot of that, but I'm probably not going to delve into it too much, even as I know how important it is.
Question down.
I think we want to circle this way. Oh.
Hello? Okay. I have a question. So, Anna, you've done work on sort of race relations and health. What's special about education? So what do you, after doing all this work, is there something unique about this sphere of work?
What's unique about it?
Yeah, is there any new insights you gained? Because you've done a lot of work across different areas. There's something special you learned about work as you're doing work in education.
Well, for one thing, I think of this project as a project I call as my going home, because I made a very deliberate choice when I started my career to look for difference and look for the things that were not like me. So, I chased characters like Lance Armstrong or a rodeo cowboy, who's one of my favorite characters. Or, on the other hand, a woman from my town where I grew up, Baltimore, who allowed her boyfriend to kill her daughter. So that search for difference has really permeated my work for a long time, and I am a nomadic person. My lawyer today said, "Where are you?" When I talked to him on the phone, I said, "I'm in Palo Alto." He said, "If I didn't know you better, I'd think you were on the lam. Every time I call you, you're someplace else." And so I see this project as going home because my mother was a teacher. It was the only thing really African-American woman who had an education in Baltimore just about could do. All her friends were teachers. My mother believed that there was no such thing as a non-reader, and so there are all these great big 13-year-old boys. Miss Wayman reminds me of my mother. These 13-year-old boys sitting at our dining room table, they were not going to leave the 6th grade without being able to read. And so I feel that this is the very, very, very important project to me because it's taking me back to the people who taught me. One of the things that Linda Darling Hammond said to me is that, the way that people teach is really informed by their own learning experiences. How did they learn? And the necessity of looking at how people really learn. So I had some very good experiences about learning. So I feel this in my heart, and that's why I'm doing it.
Thanks a lot for your terrific performance. I wonder, one of the things you mentioned as you talked about it, and it was clear from the presentations, was that you really focused a lot on violence.
I heard a lot of violence. I didn't focus. It's a lot there.
Well, but whatever came out, there was a lot of violence in it. And I think that maybe, since I'm Sean's colleague, I can make a recommendation to him from the 30,000 feet that maybe we should study, in terms of inequality, we should study more about the nature of violence. I'm not saying that necessarily there's less, I would say there's necessarily less violence in the lives of upper middle class kids, but it may be a different kind of violence, but we're a very violent society. We're not the only violent society. There are plenty of them, but maybe this is what we should be studying more of rather than test scores, because test scores might just be an expression of what you're bringing. This is what you inspired in me.
Well,
in terms
last
of this.
year, when I was invited, thanks to Jonathan Rabinowitz, who I hope he's here, invited me to come, alerted me about the Education Writers Conference that was here. And of course, the lunch keynote speaker was Arnie Duncan, who was talking about violence then. And that really tipped me off. So that's a policy person who tipped me off, really, about violence and about trauma. And some of the most interesting people that I'm talking to are the people who are doing work on trauma. And I don't know how they're going to derail it, but really accepting the fact that these kids are living in trauma and what Dr. Harris yesterday was calling toxic stress.
What's interesting, in all the international comparisons, none of the questionnaires, as far as I remember, ask anything about violence. Well, there's one, and that is in Latin America. There are questions about school violence in the questionnaire. But generally, they don't ask that question, and it's quite revealing because there are quite big differences in what kids report about the amount of violence they face on a day-to-day basis. So we could study more of that. And thanks for bringing that to us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question on this side. Let's get someone over here. Yeah, okay.
Hi. This was lovely. First, thank you. I'm wondering, I was struck by when you mentioned that some people are talking about the greater structure and how it plays a role in this, and some people aren't. And I'm wondering if you'll have the chance to bring these stories not to Berkeley Rep and not to Stanford, but some to the other communities.
Talea, what are we going to do? That will happen.
Yeah.
In part because the theaters that are working with me, you know, I'm not inventing community engagement, civic engagement. And they all have incentives, a variety of ways, to care about civic engagement. And we will go also to probably Stockton, and we'll probably like do a performance sort of in a high school auditorium and do a lot of work to, that'll be very important to us, the outreach that we're doing. And it's already started because we don't leave a town without inviting the people that we've been talking to come and have a meal with us or be with us. And so we have our little disciples out there that we're hearing from.
One up top here.
Hi, I've been a public high school teacher for the last 20 years. And I think one of the things that might help would be to bring a politician into my classroom and spend 6 weeks there. I teach at Bal in San Francisco. And I used to take a little dog and pony show around to teachers' conventions called The Use of Graffiti in Teaching Inner City Kids How to Read. Because in our curriculum, we were giving kids from the jungles of El Salvador Pride and Prejudice. Huh? And, but they could all read 23rd Street Gang in Roman numerals. And so, but I do believe we could have a politician as well as you come to the classroom. Just teach them something.
Hi. I grew up, thank you, by the way, it was wonderful. But I grew up with a series of kids, street kids, who all, well, the system failed them. And one of them recently told me something that just struck me incredibly as the most beautiful and sad thing I've ever heard. And you talking about the teachers who are involved in these situations reminded me of it. And they said for these kids who, she was talking about our friends and how they grew up and how that this whole idea of the American dream turned into the American nightmare for these kids, and how we're not only failing these kids, we're failing ourselves as a society. We're not living up to the ideals that America or education or any of these lofty ideals, we're just throwing them down the toilet when we don't allow these children to get the kind of education or the fighting chance that they deserve. And I wondered if you had any experience personally or maybe talking to someone about these kinds of issues.
You want to say anything?
That's you.
That's you.
Well, I mean, I would just go back to Maxine Greene quoting Thomas Jefferson, throwing away the rubbish. That's what he said it, and it's come to, you know, the chickens have come home to roost.
Hi there. I don't usually need a mic. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk in one, but I work on trauma and toxic stress in the classroom, and specifically on child sexual abuse. And with respect to the question, I just thank you so much for today, and thank you to the organizers for bringing you here. With respect to the question about academics and rational language and meeting the master's needs around academia, I just think Patricia Williams and Robert Coles are really interesting examples around how to push out of that. And with respect to the question about relationships being the basis of autonomy, of policy, there's a woman named Jennifer Nadelsky. She's in law and philosophy at the University of Toronto. She came out of Oxford University Press a couple of years ago with a book on exactly that, how we need to develop policy and law based on relationships. So I just wanted to say that. Very quickly, a question. I've moved into looking at theater as a tool with respect to the work I'm doing around child sexual abuse and trauma in the classroom. And so my question to you is actually about performance. And if you can share anything that you've learned in all your years of extraordinary performance, and anything you do differently now as a performer because of what you've learned that I could learn and
I'm
would I
giving a
need to
workshop
do?
in San Francisco from June 9th to June 16th with some amazing teachers, people who have taught me. And I would recommend that you come to our workshop called Personal Narratives, Global Identities. You're all invited from the 9th to the 16th. It will end in a performance at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. So you should come take our workshop and bring your one-page narrative, and we will teach you everything we know from the point of view of a Alvin Ailey dancer and NYU graduate and Juilliard Alexander teacher, a wonderful novelist, Sarah Manica. It's going to be a shower for your soul.
Hi. Thank you, of course. I'm really interested in how you conduct your interviews, and I'm wondering, you get people to tell these incredible stories. How do you cultivate, or do you cultivate a relationship with them first? How do you get people to open up, and what kinds of questions do you ask?
Well, first of all, like I said to the gentleman who asked about listening, I only ask about things that I don't really know about. That's number one. And I try to pick people who I think would scream from a mountaintop. I just happen to be there. So I'd like to pick people who have a lot to say. And then there was a wonderful cinematographer with me in Philly, Steve McCarthy, and he made fun of me because he said I should have a book called Say More About That. That's what I say most of the time. Is they'll say something and I'll say, well, say more about that, Talk about that. I keep saying that over and over again. Talk about that. Say more about that.
We'll take one last question. Right here in the front. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll take two last questions.
This question was prompted by Stephanie's story. And I know you've been talking about the 30,000-foot level, but Stanford also trains practitioners. And clearly, Stephanie's story was an example of the needing to train or help young teachers in supporting themselves, not just young teachers, but as they continue to be exposed to the traumatic stories of the children with whom they work, whether or not they themselves are wounded healers or not. And maybe I'm asking the question of the dean or the two of you of how does Stanford prepare the students, their student teachers in that way?
I think that is a great question, and I mean, I wish that we could just talk about that sometime, because obviously how do you train people to deal with this huge amount of emotional material that's coming into how do you do that? One of the people I didn't have a chance to do that I was talking to you all about last night, one of my favorites, Cheryl Hendrickson, who teaches in a jail, young white teacher, sitting in the back of a classroom with a kid who had a scar down the side of his neck from a machete, and into the room walked a 350-pound Samoan girl, 17-year-old pimp, tearing the school apart, and they try not to restrain them, the students, so the teachers all ran and hid in the closet. And the kid with the machete scar jumped out the window. I mean, it's like, what kind of skills would be needed? That's a far cry from my office hours at Stanford University, I have to say. And I thought they were hard.
Yeah.
Last question.
Thank you so much. This has just been a wonderful, wonderful performance. I have spent many years as a teaching artist, and specifically teaching Shakespeare. Shout out, happy birthday, Shakespeare, for 150 years today.
Whoa!
And I'm completely burnt out. So I've left. I'm now sort of trying to get up to the 30,000 foot level. I've gone back to school, but I have this instinct, and perhaps it's a very naive instinct, but I've also, being my own, I think everybody is an empiricist at some level, but seeing what what you can do in a class to change the classroom ecology when you bring the practices, some of the practices of the theater, like checking in, and just checking in for the emotional temperature. And I've often felt like 1 hour a week is just, you're just, excuse my language, pissing in the wind. But I've had kids say, Shakespeare eats balls, I ain't gonna do this shit. And then 10 weeks later, you see this amazing transformation, and it has something to do with actually seeing them where they're at, but also there's something about Shakespeare, the humanity, and that's, I guess my question is about the sort of abandoning the arts and the humanities, which are, how do we know ourselves? How do we even become conscious if we don't have the arts and humanities? And so, you know, I guess my question is this instinct a valid instinct? I know it can't be quantified, but it's, you know, my qualitative research says that it does work. What's your opinion?
Well, I don't know where the Stanford School of Education stands on arts and education. But I hope that, you know, some people say that we are in a kind of a sea change right now. I do think it's a very hopeful moment, just based on the kinds of people I'm meeting who are working so hard. And I hope that part of what's going to be in that sea of rising boats will be bringing art back into the schools, because and you shouldn't leave that out from 30 feet up. Let's leave it at that. 30,000 feet up.